The National Park Subcommittee of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to the first hearing of the National Park Subcommittee for the 118th Congress. Looking forward to today's hearing. We'll be focusing on the National Park Service's fiscal year 2024 budget request. Welcome Director Chuck Sams to the subcommittee. Looking forward to our discussion. Joining Director Sams is Comptroller Jessica Bowron. Again, welcome to you both, and thanks for your time. I'm pleased to see that the President requested an overall increase of $289 million for a total of $3.8 billion for the Park Service. However, fixed costs for the Park Service increased by $120 million, which would leave an additional $169 million for increased impact for those of you that are following the math. Part of that increase, the budget outlines an increase of 1,369 employees, which would bring staffing up to 20,759. This is an important step toward the 23,000 employees that Senator Daines and I have been advocating for. It also shows that the Park Service is wisely using the $500 million Congress recently provided for long-term staffing purposes in the Inflation Adjustment Act. It's my hope this trend continues until we get to our workforce goal. The chart that I've brought, that my staff prepared, indicates the blue lines are visitation. The orange line is staffing. And as you can see, a dramatic increase year by year in visitation, a decline in staffing. Now, the good news is it's on the upswing. And as you can see, it's coming up and projected to come up again this year, and for that we congratulate you. But the point I want to make is we're not where we should be. Just going back to the staffing ratio to visitation of 2010. So we're moving in the right direction, but we want to maintain that momentum. And I think it's very important because this is a fundamental part of the experience of people visiting the national parks. If there's inadequate staffing, they don't have the experience and the full ability to enjoy the parks that they should. In addition to staffing, one of the challenges facing the Park Service is maintenance, both routine and deferred. On routine maintenance, I'm concerned we're not investing to meet the challenges the system faces. The total facility maintenance line item request is an increase of $93 million. However, both the repair and rehabilitation and the cyclical maintenance are kept flat as the same levels they've been for the last 2 years. I hope to better understand why that is and if these sub-accounts should receive greater priority. On the deferred side of maintenance ledger, there is some good news and some bad news, and Congress will need to make some hard decisions. I want to pause here for a moment. The Congress, through a bipartisan, Senator Daines and I were prime sponsors of the Great American Outdoors Act to address deferred maintenance. My concern is that we're still deferring maintenance, that instead of digging out of the hole, we're helping. The Great American Outdoors Act unquestionably has been a significant step forward, but at the same time, there's still more deferred maintenance, so we're still digging, and I think that's something that we really need to be discussing. As I mentioned, Vice Chair Daines and I were part of a bipartisan group of senators that negotiated the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. It was monumental, and its biggest impact on the National Park Service was establishing the five-year Legacy Restoration Fund. The fund provided the Park Service with $6 billion to repair and recapitalize assets that had significant deferred maintenance. These are repairs that should have been made long ago, but because of budget constraints were deferred and now require bigger investments than they might have had they been fixed in the first place. At the time we passed the bill, we thought, and we debated, the total deferred maintenance backlog was $12 billion. Remember that figure? That was the figure we were using. We hoped that would be able to cut that backlog in half. Unfortunately, we now know at the end of fiscal 22, the total deferred maintenance backlog is more like $22 billion. There are a couple of explanations for that large change, and I think we need some reminders. The increase came about because the Park Service updated how it tracks and catalogs the maintenance backlog. Now, the service looks at what it will take to get the assets back to working condition instead of simply adding up work orders which were focused on short-term Band-Aid fixes. This has resulted in what appears on the surface to be a huge increase in the maintenance backlog, but a more accurate assessment in my view. I don't blame the Park Service for this change. We need to use the most accurate data available, even when it tells us what we don't want to hear, though I must say it is somewhat disheartening. So I want to hear about how we define success now that our baseline has changed so markedly. As we are approaching the end of the Legacy Restoration Fund, this subcommittee needs to think about what comes next and how we will define that success. If we're going to even think about extending the Restoration Fund, I want to be sure I understand the current state of the deferred maintenance backlog, what the Park Service is doing to most effectively and efficiently use that funding, and making sure they're not relying too heavily on the Great American Outdoors Act funding to supplant annual appropriations that should also be going toward routine maintenance and repairs. You can't depend upon being bailed out by a Great American Outdoors Act every 5 years. Maintenance has to be done on an ongoing basis. Even if there was not a routine maintenance gap, the deferred maintenance backlog vanished, we would still have challenges recapitalizing assets when they reach the end of their useful life. So perhaps there's a role for a permanent recapitalization fund. On a final note, I also want to say that I'm very pleased by how the Park Service has been moving toward the selection of projects for funding under the Great American Outdoors Act. Deferred maintenance is not evenly spread across the country, but I know the service has been diligent in making sure projects of varying sizes across a variety of park unit types have benefited from the funding. The fiscal year 2024 list of projects would spend $1.33 billion and retire $1.25 billion in deferred maintenance. That's a pretty good ratio. I look forward to actually seeing that reduction in the coming years. Now I'll turn to Vice Chair Daines for his opening statement, and then to Director Sams for his opening statement, and we'll get to questions. Senator Daines.
Chairman King, thank you. As I said many times, our parks actually bring this city of Washington together more often than not, and our country together as well. Over the years, Congress has worked together to support and enhance our national park system, truly one of the great gifts to the people of our great nation. In 2020, the President signed the Great American Outdoors Act. Many said it was the greatest conservation win in perhaps up to 50 years. It was a historic investment in our parks, and I could not agree more with Chairman King's comments that the Great American Outdoors Act was a very important, monumental kind of achievement here in Washington, but it wasn't meant to replace the need to continually fund backlog and taking care of the backlog maintenance issue in terms of ongoing appropriations. It was meant to be kind of a jump start to it to get out of the hole, but not a means to replace what needs to be taken care of, which is the maintenance of our parks. It's debt. Chairman King has said that before. We got to think about maintenance backlog as debt that's held by our parks. It's crumbling housing for park employees. It's outdated and overloaded wastewater systems. It's inaccessible trails and parking areas littered with potholes. And that's why we came together and passed the Great American Outdoors Act. And while we've seen great work done with that funding, we've also seen the maintenance backlog continue to grow. It's simply unsustainable. And grow, I think, is probably an understatement. I mean, massively, virtually doubling. I look forward to discussing how the Park Service has implemented this important law and how we can reduce the process and improve the process to reduce the national park maintenance backlog. The committee also came together to introduce the Gateway Community and Recreation Enhancement Act. This bill, sponsored by the chairman and myself, supports our gateway communities. It spreads visitation to lesser-known recreation areas. It improves visitation data, creates a digital park pass, and all these are, I think, important, tangible steps in supporting parks and local communities. This issue is even more important after the devastating flood that occurred in Yellowstone National Park last year. We're just about coming up on the one-year anniversary. Ensuring quick recovery for both the park and gateway communities is extremely important. I want to applaud the Park Service And as we chatted as well, Mr. Sams, the work that Superintendent Shawley did for the hard work was tireless, and his team there, where they continued to, it was a 24/7 operation there, and it's remarkable what they accomplished in relatively short construction season we have in places like Yellowstone Park. And we want to look more at digging deeper in the recovery efforts here today. Finally, I think it's important this committee continue to look at the housing solutions. As Chairman King put that staffing chart on the board there, when both of us engage with our respective superintendents at our great parks, both sometimes in our backyards, literally, and around the country, we hear there's a connection between staffing and housing. As we've seen, more Americans want to move closer to beautiful parts of our country where our national parks are located. It's taking big spikes in housing costs, and we've got to find a way here to provide that housing for employees. I think the increasing in housing construction that I saw in the Park Services budget is a good start, but I do think we have to look more holistically at the problem. Both the employees, the teachers, restaurant workers, families that serve our gateway communities are struggling with access to housing. The problem is most acute in places like Montana, where surrounding federal land make it nearly impossible to even expand additional housing or services. I look forward to working with the chairman and my colleagues to try to find more solutions to this growing problem. With that, Mr. Chairman, I want to turn it back to you. I look forward to a robust discussion and the testimony from witnesses.
Director Sams, welcome to the committee.
Chair King, Ranking Member Daines, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on the fiscal year 2024 budget request for the National Park Service. I would like to summarize my testimony and submit my entire statement for the record. I would first like to thank the subcommittee for your support of the National Park Service in fiscal year 2023. Over the past year, I've visited parks across the country and seen firsthand some of the challenges they are facing, like recovery from natural disasters, adapting to increased or changing visitation, and a need to expand the breadth of the stories that we are telling. I've also seen and heard from our employees about how much recent funding increases through fiscal year 2023 appropriations, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Great American Outdoors Act are making an impact. I thank you for your support, and I am pleased to share with you how our fiscal year 2024 budget will support continued progress. The discretionary budget request for the National Park Service is $3.8 billion, an increase of $289.2 million compared to fiscal year 2023 enacted funding. I want to highlight a few components with you: conservation, racial justice, capacity, and housing. Our request proposes an additional $110.7 million in service-wide investments to protect resources from 21st century threats. Fundamental to this effort is an $86.8 million increase in operational funding to enhance natural resource capacity, expand youth core programs, and support conservation and improve climate risk assessments and responses for our cultural resources. We also propose installing additional charging infrastructure to support the transition to zero-emission vehicles, complete climate vulnerability assessments, and better position the agency to respond to natural disasters. The fiscal year 2024 budget proposes $32.3 million in increased investments to advance racial justice and equity for underserved communities, including strengthening our nation-to-nation relationship with tribes. The budget supports an additional $7.1 million for expanded tribal co-stewardship of park resources, $2.5 million to increase tourism and benefits tribes, $2.5 million in dedicated funding for tribal heritage grants, and $1 million for management of subsistence uses of national park lands and waters in Alaska. The initiative also supports funds to improve physical and programmatic accessibility and invests in new parks like New Philadelphia National Historic Park and Blackwell School National Historic Site. The fiscal year 2024 request also invests in our employees. The National Park Service has lost almost 19% of its operations capacity since 2011, as Senator King has pointed out. Over the same period, over 30 units have been added to the national park system, and annual visitation has increased by more than 30 million visitors. To help meet the demand, the budget seeks $25.4 million to support an additional 170 FTEs, or full-time employees. This increase will address new and critical responsibilities across the parks and bolster the U.S. Park Police and Special Agents program. Lastly, The budget proposes an increase of $7 million to construct, improve, and modernize housing for National Park Service employees, which remains a critical issue at parks with insufficient available or unaffordable housing. This will help tremendously. Finally, I'm pleased to update you on our progress to implement the Great American Outdoors Act. Funding from the Legacy Restoration Fund has provided us almost $3.9 billion for deferred maintenance. We have obligated more than $1.4 billion, with over 70 projects underway and more starting this year. From the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the National Park Service has received nearly $300 million for land acquisition activities and over $1 billion for state grant programs matched by non-federal funds for a total of impact of at least $2 billion. Chair King, Ranking Member Daines, this concludes my summary. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and for your continued support of the National Park Service, and I'm happy to answer any and all your questions.
Thank you. And I take it you're here to answer questions. You have an opening statement?
No statement.
Thank you. Well, obviously, both the Vice Chair and I talked about deferred maintenance, and there's a rule of thumb, Mr. Director, in the private sector that you should be doing 2 to 4% of the value of your assets as a ongoing maintenance budget. Otherwise, you're going in the hole. It's hard to do all of the, it's hard to get a fix on what the value overall of the assets of the National Park Service, but it appears that we're below 1% now in terms of what we're doing in terms of maintenance. I guess I would start by saying defend that and reassure me about the future. You understand the concern here. It was not easy to get the Great American Outdoors Act through. And in this budgetary situation, I think it would be even more difficult. Plus, we don't have Rob Portman and Lamar Alexander with us. So let's talk about getting the maintenance budget right so that we're not digging the hole deeper in the hopes of a future Great American Outdoors Act.
You know, we're doing better calculations of how we're doing the deferred maintenance. That's first and foremost. We weren't really using industry standards. And when you look back and it travels across the United States, last year alone I visited over 60 parks. I've seen more water treatment plants than I've ever planned to see in my life. But that's a good thing because water is extremely important to all of our visitors, ensuring that it's cool, clean, and potable. That being said, we also know that over the last 30, 40 years, the maintenance costs that you had been seeing in deferred maintenance really was just the Band-Aid effect, meaning our on-the-ground maintenance staff were looking at it on what would it keep just to keep it going, rather than looking at what it would take to do surgery on this particular matter. As we've calculated that maintenance, it did, in fact, double in price, and that was also a surprise to me. But I now trust the data that actually is being inputted into the system to better manage this issue.
I think we should point out that suddenly there wasn't a lot more deferred maintenance. It was a different way of accounting for it and determining what the amount was.
Absolutely, sir. And it was really looking at more of the surgical approach. What will it take to really repair this for sustainability for the next 50, 70, 80 years? And that's why that price increased.
But I'm not, I want to focus on the boring old operation budget and how much is in there for maintenance ongoing, not deferred maintenance, but just maintenance so that we're not deferring. My worry is that in this budget, there's not enough for ongoing sustained maintenance, which is only going to make a deferred maintenance problem get bigger in the future.
Yes, our cyclic maintenance is an issue we're looking at. We're going to delve more deeply into how we can ensure that they're
And that number's flat for the last 3 years.
Yes, sir. You know, we have 75,000 different assets. 60% are very unique, you know, monuments, memorials, such as the Statue of Liberty and others. And looking at how we do that cyclic maintenance, we need to dig deeper in that and figure out what those true costs are so that we can more accurately come back to you and talk to you about that.
Well, this budget has already been submitted. It's going to be worked through the appropriations process, but I sincerely urge you, the next budget, we should see a growth in annual maintenance in order to prevent the development of further deferred maintenance in the future.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Changing the subject, on staffing, how are you doing on recruiting? Every business I talk to is having difficulty recruiting. Are you able to fill these new positions that we've authorized?
Thank you for the question, Senator. That is one of the issues that is a challenge for us. We're using every tool available in our tool chest to be able to recruit and bring in the best and the brightest and the most diverse workforce that really reflect who America is in our national park system. That being said, we do have some impediments. The market has been very tight for all employers. We're trying to figure out our best ways to entice folks to come into the service. In that end, with the great support of the Inflation Reduction Act and the $500 million, we're bringing in over 30 recruiters to go out and meet people where they're at in colleges and trade schools to be able to start recruiting those folks to come in. And we're looking again at exactly what tools we might need enhancement on and plan on coming back and talking with you directly about that.
I also serve on the Armed Services Committee, and the military is having exactly the same problem, although interestingly, except for the Space Force, they're oversubscribed. That doesn't apply, but perhaps it does in a sense. One of the things that they're talking about is that mission is an important part of recruitment. It's not just about money or benefits. And it seems to me you're not defending the country, but the mission of the national parks is something that should be attractive to young people as a career. Is that emphasized in your recruiting efforts?
Absolutely. I think our best recruiters are our folks in uniform in the green and gray. They show and demonstrate the passion that they have for the Organic Act and our mission as a service. And that does attract a lot of folks. I would say the folks that we have recruited over the last year and the new staff that I've met out in the field, they talk about being mission-driven and the work that we have done since 1916 and will continue to do. And I think that has been a very attractive way of recruiting new members.
Final area of concern is housing. Recruiting housing relates, I know, in Acadia, we've just passed a land swap that will, a land change that will allow additional housing to be developed. I take it that this is a problem across the country as you visit these parks.
Absolutely. The issue is really a factor of both quantity of housing units as well as our quality. And we have projects planned that will address rehabilitating existing housing facilities where units are in disrepair and obsolete and not currently suitable for employees. By example, Chaco Cultural National Historic Park, we have existing housing units that are unlivable. A proposed line item construction project will demolish the existing structure and build a new multiplex units with a bed-for-bed replacement. At Mesa Verde National Park, a project will rehab and stabilize existing foundations and building envelopes of historic residences. While we address these projects, we are also evaluating the quantity necessary for the workforce. The housing market, as we all are very much aware of, has been a challenge for many of us in recent years, and especially due to COVID, natural disasters, and affected in other ways of where we're at. And so with the increase of the $7 million, which would bring over $15 million to allow us to do additional leasing and upgrades and building, we're investing also nearly $100 million in fiscal year 24's proposed budget on the housing issue.
You mentioned those parks, Mesa Verde and Chaco. 20 years ago right now, my family and I were on a round-the-country RV trip for 5.5 months, and we visited, I think, 17 national parks, and they were I thought my kids were sort of bored, but then when we went into Yellowstone and a herd of buffalo across the road, they just came alive. That was one of the highlights of the trip. So thank you for the work that you're doing, Director Sampson. We'll come back and have a few more questions in a second round. Senator Daines.
Thanks, Chairman King. As I mentioned earlier, last year, Yellowstone Park suffered from flooding, which destroyed roads, bridges, wastewater systems. And we were very fortunate to have Superintendent Cam Shawley leading the park because under his leadership, a quick action plan was created. Recovery began immediately, and they got back on their feet faster than many anticipated. Director Sams, what actions still need to be taken at the park for recovery? And how does your budget reflect the needs of the park and the community to restore and prevent further damage?
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you all for the $60 million in emergency relief available from the Department of Transportation through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Yellowstone was able to reconnect access between Gardner and Mammoth and Cook City to Tower Roosevelt within months after the floods rather than years. That was critical to that, and Cam and his team being able to implement that, work closely with transportation, work closely with those gateway communities, really opened up access so that we continue to be able to be of support back and forth between our gateway communities. The interim roads will continue to see work through this summer, of course. Another major ongoing investment in process is addressing temporary wastewater treatment needs at Mammoth particularly. In addition, with the disaster supplemental provided by the subcommittee for fiscal year 2023, Yellowstone can begin to work on permanent repairs needed for the roads and other infrastructure. This is currently still estimated at $916 million. NPS is working now to develop options and more detailed cost estimates to address the extent of the actual infrastructure damages within the park. We do not have an updated cost estimate at this time, though we do expect the work to take place over the next 3 to 5 years to fully complete it, and that will be reflected, of course, in our operational budget for the park.
Thank you. I remember shortly after the flood, I had a chance to get a helicopter tour, and in fact, I was taking videos with my phone here, sending them to Chairman King, so we could see the damage, certainly, of the road with that little small canyon, the Gardner River between Gardner and Mammoth. I mean, it's not lost on any of us. They literally rerouted that road and went up a hillside, which took an extraordinary amount, first of all, quick thinking, collaboration, building consensus on one of the iconic entryways into Yellowstone National Park, and they pulled it off, which is a great credit to Cam Shawley and his team and to the Park Service for supporting. As we've mentioned, the gateway communities were heavily impacted by flooding. It was Gardner, it was Cook City. Both were hit hard, still recovering. I mean, we came off the COVID pandemic through lost sales and so forth of our hotel and our recreation industry. We were all geared up, staffed back up, ready to go, and then got hit by this flood. Just a devastating gut punch to so many of our businesses there in those gateway communities. Question is, what actions is the Park Service taking to work with gateway communities on flood recovery? And could you talk any more specific about the Mammoth to Gardner wastewater system?
Thank you, Senator. Cam and his team immediately, once the flood subsided, started engaging our gateway communities, and we continue to. Matter of fact, very early on, when we were just trying to figure out how to bring folks in once we were able to open up the roads, it was actually a community member who came up with the idea of using the odd and even numbers of license plates. So, those generation of ideas are extremely important to us in our partnerships with gateway communities. We continue to have discussions with them around that because they're going to help us in looking how we can make those roadways more resilient as they come in and out of parks. When we look at the issues at Mammoth, that actually is fortuitous in a strange way. We had an old wastewater treatment system that we were able to bring back online because we had old parts around. But we need to update, of course, and bring in a modern system. But the old system was able to hold us over until now as we're doing out the bids to bring in a new wastewater treatment system.
Thanks. One of the communities that got a little less attention but was greatly impacted was West Yellowstone. I mean, the roads in and out of West stayed open. Different drainage, certainly, from where the Yellowstone and where the water really hit there, coming out of the Beartooth and more in the Yellowstone Park area. But they got hit hard because of the decrease in attendance to the parks. I know they're also working on wastewater improvements at West Yellowstone. So while they aren't maybe getting as much attention as one, I just encourage you to reach out and also work with that very important gateway community there in West Yellowstone. I just want to flag that here today. I want to go back to the Great American Outdoors Act and what's happening here on maintenance backlog. As Chairman King mentioned, the fact that maintenance spending has remained flat for the last 3 years in terms of the normal appropriations process. It's very concerning, I know, to both of us.
Flat at a low level.
Low to begin with and flat, which only digs the hole deeper for maintenance backlog. In fact, one would argue that with the inflation, certainly, we've actually lost more ground. And when you're holding the numbers basically flat on a dollars basis, and that just concerns us. And I know there's a lot of competing priorities as it relates to where to invest dollars, but I just would urge you, as you look at your budgets, to rethink the investment in maintenance and make sure that we're getting that. We've got to be moving that number up. And as the chairman eloquently stated, we can't rely on Congress to every so often bail out the park with another big bill here addressing maintenance backlog. We're expecting you all to get back to more. We talk a lot about sustainability. We need sustainability right now in terms of our assets in our parks and maintenance. What actions would Congress and and the Park Service need to do to see results in reducing that growing and even like doubling backlog number?
Thank you, Congressman, or thank you, Senator. First, I want to say that, the $1.3 billion that we will receive from GOA funding to help us with the deferred maintenance, we're also, as far as cyclic maintenance and others, we're investing over $970 million in fiscal year 24's budget to continue to tackle that so that we are not continuing to see this growth. Of course, as we bring new systems online and new parks online, we'll end up with some forms of cyclic and deferred maintenance. But looking at it long-term, figuring that out and coming back and have further, more robust discussions with you all, I think is important. We have to demonstrate, though, to you how we're making those investments in those most critical areas.
I can guarantee you and I think the chairman's been very clear in this, and I am too, if we keep seeing flat to, with inflation really declining investments in maintenance, it's going to be a recurring discussion here at this committee. So I just urge you to go back and look at that.
Very pleasant.
It may get less pleasant, as the chairman says. So I think we really urge you to take a look at that. And we can't fund everything, so this becomes a priority question. And I think the concern we have is continue to make this a high priority. Chairman.
Senator Cantwell is trying to get here. She has a urgent problem, as you know, and I think it's an Olympic National Park. She'll be here shortly. A couple of other questions. Last year, Congress created two new wild and scenic river designations, one for the York River in Maine, the other the Housatonic. And also, we had a National Heritage Area defined in Maine, the Down East National Heritage Area. Unfortunately, apparently the wild and scenic designations for all those that came before at a certain level, the new ones are at a lower level. The same for the National Heritage level, the National Heritage Area. So I hope you'll look at that and that there'll be an equalization at some point so that the newer designees are not treated less robustly, less strongly than existing. Is that something you can look into, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Director?
Senator King, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. We've been discussing it in my office, how we're doing that, especially wild and scenic and national heritage areas. I'm a huge proponent of those national heritage areas. I think that it's a great public-private partnership where the national parks is just providing, technical support and a little bit of funding. But the amazing work that is done at the community level in the national heritage areas is extremely impressive, and I've visited several of them over the past year.
Yeah, we're not talking about a great deal of money, but there is an inequality now that I think it would be helpful to address. Second area, one of the major challenges facing the parks as we come out of the pandemic, of course, is overcrowding, is visitation, particularly at certain parks. Two areas that I've been interested in. One is the Park Service to publicize the less well-known parks to try to divert some visitation, not to say don't go to Yellowstone or don't go to Acadia or don't go to Yosemite, but here are some great places that perhaps you don't know about. You can paraphrase Ken Burns, America's best idea and some of America's best kept secrets. So publicizing some of these lesser known parks just to spread the visitation somewhat. The other is technology. Many of us use an app called Waze, W-A-Z-E, that tells us when there's congestion ahead. I've always thought a Waze for national parks would be an important contribution because somebody could look on their phone and say, well, there's a line to get into Glacier today, so perhaps we'll divert and go to another park or another state park in the area. I encourage you, and I do compliment the Park Service is now implementing online app-based admission passes, but think about this, a way of alerting people to congestion. That's a technology that's out there. If they can tell you there's a truck turned over in 5 miles away, they can also tell you there's a long line to get up Cadillac Mountain.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the efforts of both you and Senator Daines in helping us tackle that issue. I also want to thank the National Park Foundation, who's also been helping us with funding and looking how we can improve our app so that we can have more of that in-stream data so people can make an informed decision, and also how we highlight those lesser-known parks or the parks that haven't been seen. We remain committed to collaborating with, of course, local communities and tribal governments and partners to find solutions to improve the quality and diversity of the visitor experience. Planning and design efforts, social science, partnerships, and pilot strategies are targeted to support the changing visitation and desired experiences, protecting resources, and, of course, better connect visitors to parks, including historically underrepresented and excluded communities. We've completed approximately 30 visitor use management planning projects with 45 more that are ongoing. In relation to how we're working more with electronic passes, National Park Service currently offers site-specific electronic passes at 81 park sites, including Acadia, Everglades, Glacier, and Grand Canyon National Parks. Visitors may also purchase passes online, and passes may either be printed or reside on a visitor's mobile device. The Park Service plans to expand the electronic passes to all 110 entrances fee parks by the end of this calendar year. We improve our capability for verifying passes without system connectivity, installing cell signal boosters at some sites to improve connectivity. We're deploying USB scanners at some sites and working with contracted service providers to integrate scanning and validation functions with point-of-sale equipment and network computers. The Park Service is preparing to issue an RFI on state-of-the-art solutions to improve the interagency pass program by creating an electronic interagency pass, streamlining operations, improving access, and enhancing the customer visitor experience for a diverse set of populations.
If you can achieve interagency operability, you will have achieved a great deal. Yes. But think about this congestion mitigation app, if you will, because I believe that's something that, again, it addresses this overcrowding issue, not by telling people not to go, but saying, okay, if you take a side trip here for a couple of days, it'll be a more satisfying experience. Senator Daines.
A couple more questions. I want to get into this issue of Park Service housing. I think it ties back to that chart that the chairman had in terms of staffing levels and so forth. And one of the important ways to recruit and then retain staff are to ensure they have adequate housing. Your budget proposes $15 million to improve and expand Park Service housing. What's the action plan for this $15 million? And do you believe it's enough to fix the shortage of housing and the repairs needed to make some of these homes livable? $15 million just to service. I grew up in the construction business, home construction in Southwest Montana. It just seems like a pretty low number, especially when we think about the importance right now in trying to solve this staffing problem.
Thank you, Senator. The fiscal year 24 budget proposes actually over $100 million to address employee housing in parks. This includes an increase of the $7 million we're talking about for a total of $14.9 million for new construction or rehabilitation of existing employee housing where local market data shows limited availability of affordable housing for purchase or even rent. This funding will replace obsolete and deteriorated housing or add housing capacity at parks, including Mammoth Cave National Park, Sequoia Kings, Canyon National Park, and Rocky Mountain National Park. As part of the overall strategic approach to the issue, the Park Service budget also proposes $32.7 million in the line item construction and legacy restoration fund programs to rehabilitate housing at Mesa Verde, Chaco Culture, Great Sand Dunes, and National Park and Preserve. Additional funds from repair, rehab, cyclic maintenance, and quarters revenue will also support housing O&M. This strategic approach includes $2 million to support private sector leasing for seasonal housing in local communities, first enacted in fiscal year 23's budget. As of February 2023, parks are hoping to add more than 100 beds with this funding. And in Acadia, we will leverage the $5 million in donations from the partners to match the Centennial Challenge funds for construction of new seasonal employee housing. The Park Service is also pursuing administrative solutions such as strengthening current policies and procedures, seeking opportunities for public-private partnership, and consulting with the private sector, and forming a working group of park managers to make recommendations that we plan on coming back to you about some additional authorities we may need in order to have stronger public-private ventures in housing.
Yeah, that's another part of the solution, certainly that partnership, no doubt. I noticed in the budget as well, the same line as housing construction, you've included $4 million for climate change studies. Understanding the lay of the land is very important, but I know if we went and tallied up all the climate change studies going on right now across all the federal budgets, it is a massive number. I mean, the military's doing climate change studies. Now you've got in the Park Service budget as well. I just think it's important as you think about priorities, unlimited resources, that providing housing for employees and fixing this very real and living present situation for many Montanans would be a high priority versus yet another study, of which I'm sure if we inventoried all the climate change studies that are proposed right now in the federal budget, it's a long, long list. So we can't do everything at once. I just we continue to ask you to reevaluate priorities and think that through as we go forward. I want to make one final question on LWCF appraisals. We've heard concerns about the length of time that land appraisals can take at the Department of Interior's Appraisal and Valuation Services Office. It's a really important part of implementing the Land and Water Conservation Fund as we work with willing and able landowners that seek to participate. And as we know, the biological clocks tick. And sometimes, the senior members of the family have this vision, but we get hung up in the appraisal process, and sometimes we miss windows of opportunity to get something done. Could you comment on the impact this has had for National Parks Land and Water Conservation Fund work?
Thank you, Senator. We continue to work closely with the AVSO. The Department overall is addressing many of our concerns, and we continue to raise those concerns with them. The department has stood up a DO-wide working group that reports to DOI leadership, identifying root causes and changes with near-term results. I will say that building capacity, innovative recruiting, and using increased pay rate authority is allowing us to increase the number of appraisers. We currently have 105 on board, the highest since appraisal and evaluation service offices we created. And we have to focus on customer service, partnering with bureaus up front and accelerating that process, including my bureau, but making sure that we are an active partner in that decision-making process. We're seeing results. In fiscal year 22, time for completed appraisals was 169 days, below the standard of 180 days. We completed more than 3,500 appraisals evaluated at over $2 billion, but obviously there is much more work to be done. I think we're off to a good start.
Yeah.
But I also want to see that. Having come from where my previous work as a conservationist with the Trust for Public Land,
right,
I know how important the AVSO office is.
No, I'm glad you know that, and I'm glad you're scoreboarding it as well. As they say, you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And scoreboarding is very important in terms of laying out the numbers and keeping that 169. Let's drive that down further. Again, I grew up in that business, in construction and real estate, and we need to drive these appraisals. I know it's been difficult at times with COVID and some of the backlog of appraisals, but that isn't the answer around why we've had delays. And I think the third-party contracting could help speed the process up. Anything else besides, whether it's third-party contracting, anything else to speed that process up? Because we need to drive it down further.
Third-party contracting is still part of our policy, and we will continue to use that. As we continue to evaluate, I'm happy to have those discussions with you again and look forward to having those discussions. AVSO is an issue. We're going to tackle it. It's important to us in the Park Service.
Yeah.
As you said, before things start going up, we want to be able to act quickly.
Director Sams, calling it an issue is a very kind word, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Director, I meant to say this at the very beginning. I hope you'll convey to your staff and to the thousands of people that work for the Park Service the compliments of this committee for the yeoman service that they provide to the country, to their visitors. I also want to compliment you on your emphasis on tribal efforts that you outlined in your opening statement. Working with the tribes across the country and the relationship with the Park Service, I think, is very important. The Inflation Reduction Act, which you mentioned several times, had $500 million for additional staffing. However, it's limited to 10 years. And I hope that the Park Service begins now to think about how to sustain that funding, whether to fold it into the ongoing budget or what the strategy will be, because limited funding, the deadline has a way of coming. So I hope that this is some of your planning for dealing with the ongoing staffing needs that are being met by that law, but which has a limited duration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sitting to my left, I call my comptroller my dream maker or my dream killer. And she's been very, very thoughtful in how we are implementing this money up into the year 2030. We're looking and strategically placing folks in parks with the money, and we're figuring out how we will absorb those in their base operations and make those requests annually, because you are absolutely right. We don't want to get to the end, and we don't want to be at a cliff where we're finally making the capacity where American people want to see our rangers in the parks, and then all of a sudden they're not there anymore. I want to say to Jessica and her team have worked very closely with the operations staff, my administrative staff, to develop our proposal and strategic way of how we're going to move that forward.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell wanted to be here this morning, has another commitment, so I'm going to follow up with a question that she would want to be addressed this morning. As you know, Washingtonians, recreationalists, people in the region of Olympic National Park are mourning the burning of the visitor center, which burned to the ground on Sunday. It's a historic lodge. 300,000 travelers visit that landmark every year. Just last year, Olympic National Park received $11 million of Great American Outdoors Act funding to renovate the historic Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center. There it is. I visited myself some years ago. Unfortunately, it was a foggy day, so I understand there's a great view, but I didn't see it. This is an important investment that was made last year to address the park's $190 million in deferred maintenance, and an investment in the surrounding community, depending upon the rejuvenation of the visitor center to increase access and attract more visitors to the Olympic Peninsula region. The Olympic National Park is one of the top 15 most visited national parks in the country, creates 2,700 jobs. Visitors spend over $250 million in the Olympic Peninsula gateway communities. Much of this spending is during the summer tourism season, which is set to begin Memorial Day weekend at Hurricane Ridge, just a few weeks away. Washingtonians, particularly those living on the Olympic Peninsula, are worried and in need of some answers. The 17-mile paved road leading from Port Angeles to Hurricane Ridge has been closed to the public since March 27th. And while the visitor center was closed for renovations, that stretch of road is very popular because it has many trailheads and scenic views. Prior to the fire that wiped out the visitor center, the road was expected to reopen by Memorial Day weekend, as I mentioned, just a few weeks away. The first question is, when can visitors expect the road to Hurricane Ridge to reopen, and what are the obstacles to reopening the road?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to answer Senator Cantwell's question, I was also very disheartened. My family and I were coming from a camping trip on Sunday when we heard the news. I got word that the fire was taking place. It's still smoldering as we speak. We've stood up a small incident command team. We have investigators who will be showing up later today so that we can look at what has happened there and determine how the fire was started and the cause of the fire. We are committed to figuring out what those costs are going to be. The road will continue to remain closed because of the safety concerns until such time as that my team there lets me know that it can reopen. We had hoped, of course, that it would have been open by May 25th, but with the result of this fire, it's going to take a little bit longer.
But you are intent on getting that road open as soon as possible, given that the road itself is an attractive asset. And you've already testified nobody yet knows the cause of the fire.
That's correct. We have not. The investigation team is on their way. And
is this an investigation team that's part of the Park Service?
Yes, it's part of our investigation team, and I can't remember if we have outside or not.
ATF.
Yes, we do have. Who?
Alcohol, tobacco.
Oh, thank you. ATF is going to be also helping with this in the investigation.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell understands it's an evolving situation. We're trying to get the fire out. It's still smoldering, as you suggest. I think her final question is, what are the plans for rebuilding? Will you commit to working with Senator Cantwell and the park in the efforts to rebuild the visitor center?
We are committed. We know that it's a very popular and useful site. We are committed to rebuilding there, and we will work very closely with the senator and the park and the local community in figuring out what we will replace it with.
Thank you. On behalf of Senator Cantwell, I know she'll be reassured by those statements. Thank you, Mr. Director. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Sams, it's great to see you again, and good to have you in front of the committee. I hope all is well. As you know, you've got a large influence in my state, and we've got beautiful parks under your jurisdiction, and I thank you for taking care of them. As you're well aware, visitation at the parks in my state remains high. This is, of course, good news, but it does contribute to some of the challenges related to crowding at park entrances and at popular trails within those parks, especially at really popular parks like Zion. Stakeholders in Washington and Kane counties, in the southwest corner of my state, proactively developed a number of creative strategies to address the crowding issues at Zion. These are the two counties in which Zion's found, in order to avoid the harmful economic impacts of a timed entry system. And this is a strategy that involves dispersing visitors to some of the lesser-known areas within the park, as well as to, other trails and attractions in the greater Zion system. In an ENR hearing in July of 2021, so not quite 2 years ago, Deputy Director Mike Reynolds, who at the time was the Intermountain Regional Director, assured me that, quote, the NPS is committed to collaborating with local communities, businesses, and nonprofit partners to find solutions that address crowding and congestion in a thoughtful way, close quote. Do you agree with Deputy Director Reynolds?
I absolutely do, sir.
And could you describe your vision for what local collaboration ought to look like in this context?
I remain committed, the service remains committed in working with our gateway partners, our communities, state leadership, county leadership, on how we can best manage visitation within our most popular parks. And as you pointed out, highlighting some of the lesser-known parks so that we can get folks but rotate them through. We're committed to looking at and figuring out how to bring technology to these parks and talking with our local folks and how we can bring in that technology to manage how the roads are currently used, how's traffic coming in and out of the park, so folks can actually make an informed decision on when it may be best for them to come at a later time or even a later day.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I encourage you as you do that to just focus as much as you can on engaging the local governments, the locals, including and especially the local governments from the beginning, rather than just filling them in on the details after the fact. Because they know the local patterns better than anybody else, having lived there, most of them, for most or all of their lives. They know what will work and what won't. They've seen the ebb and flow of visitors over the years. On a different topic, Utah has had a great winter. As you know, we get most of our water from snowpack, and this year we've had a lot of snowfall, and in fact we've set records for snowfall and for the resulting snowpack. While this provides some great temporary relief, water level and continued recreation access at Glen Canyon remains a concern in the context of this ongoing drought we've had. Considering the changes in the hydrology at the lake this year, how will your recreation operations likely change relative to last year?
Thank you, Senator Lee. We are working very closely with our partners at Glen Canyon, along with the concessionaires, and trying to the impacts. Very appreciative of the disaster relief money the subcommittee supported last year to help us with that. We're going to bring those funds to bear to mitigate for some of those issues, but we are committed to making sure that the recreation is open, because we understand the economic impact that has to our community as a whole and to the users who just wish to enjoy that particular and beautiful place.
You're talking about the $26 million in disaster supplemental relief last year, which was, of course, prioritized for North Lake Powell access. I understand several designs have been in the works to improve and extend ramp access. Can you provide an update on how those funds are being used?
I'm going to go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
So at Glen Canyon, there's actually... At Glen Canyon, there's an open solicitation for the Bullfrog Marina relocation that should close later this month.
Great.
That will move that marina off the bay and onto the main channel of the Colorado, which will really guarantee access for years to come.
And it's deep right there, so that you should be
Once
should be
you're on
good
the
to go once
channel.
it's there.
Yeah.
And Mr. Chair, as my final seconds are ticking down, I've got one more question, if that's okay. In 2021, the Park Service finalized a rule that enhanced access for off-road vehicles within the park by authorizing street-legal OHV use on the park, on most paved and unpaved roads, permitting access to 14 accessible shorelines, including the Lone Rock Beach and play area. Preserving access to this is a priority for me and for lots and lots of recreators within the state. Now, I understand that the rule is being litigated in the D.C. Circuit. Are you defending the rule in that litigation?
Senator, I have to get back to you on that particular question, but I want to say, though, the off-roading vehicle community has been a great partner of ours, and I want to continue to work with them and find those solutions. Most recently, I was, for National Park Week, was at Cape Cod, and the off-road vehicle folks brought over 70 people to help with a beach cleanup. I understand that they appreciate the resource, and they are also good stewards of those resources.
They are. I think they are generally, particularly those focused in this area, in the Glen Canyon area. They've been good stewards of the land, and this is how a lot of people access and recreate down there. And so be shutting a lot of people off if we didn't have that. So I look forward to your update on that. Thank you. Thank you both very much.
Director Sams, thank you so much for being with us. Madam Comptroller, thank you for being with us, and thank you for your important work on behalf of one of the most important assets that this country has. It's a sacred mission, and we're delighted that you have taken on its stewardship. Thank you again, and don't hesitate to be in touch with this committee at any time. It doesn't have to be a formal hearing. If there are issues that come up as we're moving through the process, particularly the budget process, I hope the department will let us know if they encounter special needs, perhaps such as the rebuilding of the visitor center at Olympic National Park. Thank you again for your testimony. We will have a week for members of the committee to submit additional questions, and we look forward to our next opportunity to discuss these issues with you. Thank you both for being with us. The hearing is adjourned.